Today we shall continue speaking on the theme historical background of Middle English. The following points will be discussed: evolution of the sound system, evolution of the grammatical syntactic system in Middle English, and development of the English vocabulary. In the sound system of the English language has undergone profound changes in the 1,000 years which have elapsed since Old English period. The changes affected the pronunciation of words, word accentuation, the systems of vowel and consonant phonemes. The sound changes in the following survey are grouped into two main stages: early Middle English changes which allowed the transition from written Old English to late Middle English, the age of literary flourishing, or the age of Chaucer; and early New English changes which show the transition from Middle English to Latin New English, the language of the 18th and 19th century. In Old English, stress usually fell on the first syllable of the word, rarely on its second syllable. The prefix or the root of the word were stressed while the suffixes and endings were unaccented. Word stress in Old English was fixed, it never moved in inflection and seldom in derivation. Extensive changes of vowels are one of the most remarkable features of English linguistic history. A variety of changes affected of vowels in stressed syllables. The modification of unaccented vowels was more uniform and simple. One of the most important sound changes of the early Middle English period was the loss of Old English diphthongs and the growth of new diphthongs, with no qualitative and quantitative distinctions. Early New English witnessed the greatest event in the history of English vowels, the Great Vowel Shift, which involved the change of all Middle English language monophthongs and probably some of the diphthongs. The Great Vowel Shift is a name given to a series by changes of long vowels between 14th and the 18th centuries. During this period, all the language vowels became closer or were diphthongized. The changes can be defined as independent, as they were not caused by any apparent phonetic conditions in the syllable or in the word, but affected regularly every stressed long vowel in any position. English consonants were on the whole far more stable than vowels. A large number of consonants have probably remained unchanged through all historical periods. Thus we can assume that the sonorants m, n, l, the plosives p, b, t, d, and also k, g in most positions have not been subjected to any noticeable changes. They are found in many words descending from Old English, though their correlations in the system of phonemes have altered to a varying degree. The most important developments in the history of English consonants were the growth of new sets of sounds, affricates and sibilants, and the new phonological treatment of fricatives. Both changes added a number of consonant phonemes to the system. On the other hand, some consonants were lost or vocalized, which affected both the consonant and the vowel system. Like vowel changes, consonant changes can be shown as occurring in the transition period from written Old English to late Middle English, that is, in early Middle English, and in the transition from Middle English to the language of the 18th century, that is, in the early New period. In the course of Middle English and early New English, the grammatical system of the language underwent profound alteration. Since the Old English period, the very grammatical type of the language has changed from what can be defined as a synthetic or inflected language with a well-developed morphology. English has been transformed into English, one of the analytical type with analytical forms and ways of word connection prevailing over synthetic ones. The division of words into parts of speech has proved to be one of the most permanent characteristics of the language. Through all these periods of history, English preserved the distinctions between the following parts of speech: the noun, the adjective, the pronoun, the numeral, the verb, the adverb, the preposition, the conjunction, and the interjection. Between the 10th and 16th century, that is from late Old English to early New English, the ways of building up grammatical forms underwent considerable changes. In Old English, all the forms which can be included into morphological paradigms were synthetic. In Middle English and early New English, grammatical forms could also be built in the analytical way with the help of auxiliary words. The historical changes in the ways of building the principal forms of the verb transformed the morphological classification of the verbs. The Old English division into classes of weak and strong verbs was completely rearranged and broken up. Most verbs have adopted the ways of form building employed by the weak verbs. The dental suffix, the strict classification of the strong verbs, with a regular system of form building, degenerated. In the long run, all these changes led to increased regularity and uniformity and to the development of a more consistent and simple system of building the principal forms of the verb. The evolution of the English syntax was tied up with profound changes in morphology. The decline of the inflectional system was accompanied by the growth of the functional load of syntactic means of word connection. The most obvious difference between Old English syntax and the syntax of Middle English and New English periods is that the word order became more strict and the use of prepositions more extensive. The growth of literary forms of the language, the literary flourishing in late Middle English, and especially in the age of the Renaissance, the differentiation of literary styles and the efforts made by the 18th century scholars to develop logical, elegant style, all contributed to the improvement and perfection to English syntax. The structure of the sentence and the word phrase on the one hand became more complicated, on the other hand were stabilized and standardized. Many scholars ascribe the simplification of the English morphology and the general transformation of the grammatical system to certain facts of external history, namely to contacts with other tongues. The age of great grammatical changes between the 10th and 13th century was a time of heavy Scandinavian settlement in the northeast and of the Norman conquest. According to the estimates made by modern philologists in the course of the 1,000 years, from Old English to modern times, the English vocabulary was multiplied tenfold. Perhaps if it were possible to count all the meanings expressed by lexical items in different historical periods, the figure would be much higher. Among the changes in the vocabulary we can distinguish losses of words or their meanings, replacements, and additions. The English vocabulary suffered considerable losses when a whole stylistic stratum of words, the specific of Old English poetic vocabulary, went out of use together within the genre of Old English poetry. It has been calculated that from 80 to 85% of the Old English words went out of use in the succeeding periods. Most of these words were not simply lost, they were replaced by other words of the same or similar meanings. The development of new meanings in the existing words extended the vocabulary and led to the growth of polysemy and homonymy. For instance, Old English craft meant science, skill, strength. In Middle English and New English, craft lost the meaning science but acquired new meanings group of skilled workers, guild, and vessel. Middle English journey meant day's work. sometimes days march, later travel journey. The sources of new words are usually divided into internal and external ways. Internal ways of developing the vocabulary were productive in all historical periods. Word formation and semantic changes were equally prolific in the creation of new words and new meanings. They were exceptionally productive in the periods of rapid vocabulary growth, such as Renaissance period. The role of external sources in the extension of the English vocabulary is very considerable. As a result, the proportion of Germanic words in the English language has fallen. According to modern estimates, the native Germanic element constitutes from 30 to 50% of the vocabulary. The other 2/3 come from foreign sources, mainly Romans.